Alright, welcome back to training for video production equipment. So this video is we're going to talk about how to set up the camera and how to control the camera for proper exposure while we're shooting. So I'm going to be demonstrating all this on one of the 4K cameras, one of the Z150s. The NX100 is absolutely identical. The menus are exactly the same. I will not be going over the menus on the V1U. At least not extensively anyway. It is similar, though not identical, and we don't use those cameras as much. So, alright, so first thing I'm going to do here is actually show you the menu itself. So this is the menu on the camera. So, whoops, back out of this. So when you press the menu button on the top of the camera, there's a menu button right there. You press the menu button on the camera, this is actually what you'll see. The first menu is camera set. We don't do a lot in here, although if we're shooting indoor or outdoor, we'll need to change the white balance preset, the WB preset here. So if we need to change that, we'll move down to that and hit the set button, and then we'll select either indoor or outdoor. Or we may be using a custom white balance. If we're doing that, I will take care of it. Well, I won't ask anybody else to handle that for us. Typically, that will be set up properly before we even start shooting. I do take time to configure the cameras before an event to make sure that things are set up as closely as possible to the ideal settings. Some tweaking may be necessary on site, but for the most part, things will be set up properly. The only other option that you should be aware of, a couple options in here they should be aware of. First of all, this digital extender. If we have a camera that's placed really far away from the subject, we can turn this on, and basically what that does is it doubles the size of everything. So allow the camera here to focus. There we go. So with digital extender on, the image is twice as large as it is with it off. You can see that switching on and off there. So we typically do not use the digital extender unless a camera is actually set really far away from the subject that we're shooting. Steady shot. If a camera is being handheld, we'll turn that to active. Otherwise, we leave it at standard. Most of these other things we will leave alone. Face detection, we typically leave that off. Picture profile. This is another one that we actually do tweak. So this basically controls the appearance of the image, and as I arrow up and down through here, you can actually see the image itself changing. I've got picture profile 1, PP1, set up for our indoor shooting, and then PP2 set up for outdoor. So if we're shooting indoor, we typically would select PP1 or PP2. Most of the time, we won't have to worry about that. But occasionally, we may need to tweak that, and if we do, I'll tell you. And to change one, we just hit the set button and then select OK. I won't ask anybody to actually configure any of the settings within the picture profile. We'll just maybe have you select a picture profile on the camera. So that is the last option on the camera set menu. Alright, so the record outset option. This will typically also be set ahead of time, however, we may need to do some tweaking. So basically, this allows us to set with the video format that we're shooting with. And in this case, we've got it set for XAVC HD, so that's the high def setting. The setting on the NX100 will be similar. The V1U doesn't have an option for this. And then down here, we're saying we're recording 30p, which is 30 frames per second at 50 megabits. That will be our typical setting for most of the things that we shoot. And down here, the simultaneous relay record, we'll actually do relay record on that. That basically what that option does is if the first memory card fills up, it automatically spills over onto the second memory card, and so we don't run out of space. So, all right, and then basically record proxy mode, we leave that off. All right, video out. Now, since this is one of the 4K cameras, when I go into the output select menu, I'm going to choose SDI. The NX100, the options are different. It has HDMI and composite instead of this one has SDI, HDMI, and then video is the standard def that we're not going to be using. So 4K we select SDI. On the NX100 we select HDMI. And then we don't worry about this last option here, unless we're shooting 4K, and then we'll have a discussion about how to set that up. Now the second option here, SDI HDMI. Typically we're shooting in 1080i because that's the standard that's used for broadcast. We could do other formats as well, but for most of the stuff that we do, we shoot in 1080i. And so we select this first option that has 1080i as the middle choice. Basically what this is saying is for HDMI it outputs 2160p, which is 4K. For SDI it outputs 1080i, and then for the video standard def connection it outputs 480i. So that's all that's saying. If we wanted to always output 1080i for either HDMI or SDI, we can choose that option down here. But for what we're doing, 2160p, 1080i, 480i is the right choice. Alright, these other options we actually don't need to mess with. Okay? Alright. Audio, I will take care of setting that. Display, you can actually tweak this a little bit to how you like it if you'd like to. Histogram shows a little graph in the lower left corner of the screen showing how much of the image is bright and how much is too dark, or how much is dark. With a histogram, let's see, can I bring that up? Apparently not. Yeah, it doesn't show up on the output. It does show up on the screen, not on the output. It shows a bar graph. It's actually on the right, lower right. I was wrong. So it's on the lower right. Maybe you can actually see that if I switch to a different source here. So, yeah, this little graph right here, it shows how much of the image is bright and how much is dark. So if I move it up where there's more brightness in the image, you can see that the bar graph actually it shows more to the right. That's there to help you judge the exposure on the camera. It's a very helpful tool. I always leave it turned on. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple other options here. Zebra. So basically what this is, this puts a zebra pattern on any of the portion of the video that's overexposed. You can turn that on and off. This level here to let you control which brightness levels in the image actually are marked with the zebra. I put it on 100 plus. Some other people like to do lower values. I like it on 100 plus. So anytime you see any zebras on the camera, when it's set to 100 plus, you know it's overexposed. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to limit the amount of overexposure in the image as much as possible. Okay. All right, next one is peaking. This is a feature I mentioned previously, but it's basically, in this case, putting red dots on the image, on any portions of the image that are actually in focus. So if we're manually focusing, we can get a quick idea of which portion of the images are in focus just by looking for the little red dots. They will show up pretty predominantly. It'd be hard to miss them. If you don't like that, you can turn that off inside this menu. Marker. These place little markers on the video. One for the center of the video, and then there's also a setting for aspect ratio. So if we were shooting 4:3 for standard def or whatever, we could mark that. Safety zone lets you see which portions of the image are guaranteed to be visible on people's TVs if they're not configured to show the full image. And then guide frame is basically a grid over the image to help you frame your shots. I personally only use the center marker when I'm shooting. All right, focus mag ratio. This is for the focus mag button. It's on the right side of the camera here. That's what allows us to zoom in 4 times. And I'm not sure that will show up on the video output. No, it doesn't. So it's showing that it's on, but it doesn't actually show the magnification. So take a look at the monitor on the camera. So when focus magnifier is engaged, the image on the viewfinder gets larger. And then from there you can use the arrows on the top of the camera to navigate around if you're trying to focus on something that's not in the center. So what that menu option does is allows you to set whether it just does 4 times, just does 8 times, or it goes in sequence between 4 times and 8 times normal magnification. I leave mine on 4. Camera data display, that shows the exposure information. I'll go over some of these in a minute. Audio level display shows whether the audio level meters. Zoom display tells whether to display a number or a bar chart. Focus displays in feet. Shutter displays in seconds. The brightness for the LCD is normal. Blah, blah, blah. Most of these we don't need to worry about, except this last one. I've got this set to all output right now, so you can see the menu. But if I set it to LCD panel, you can see that the menu goes away. So normally that would be set to LCD panel. I'm only using all output for purposes of this instruction video. All right, time code and user bit set, we're not going to worry about that. Network, we're not going to worry about that. And then this last one, there's a couple of interesting things in here. The camera profile feature allows you to save the configuration of the camera in its entirety. Saves everything, all the configuration of the camera to a memory card. So if we need to make some settings changes to a camera, we can save the settings, save the original settings before we make the changes, and then come back, make the changes. And if we don't like it, we can reload the original camera profile and get settings back to the way they are. I will have with me at any given event a memory card which contains the default settings for these cameras. So if something really gets messed up, you can come and ask me for that memory card, and I will hand it to you, and then you can reload the camera profile for that particular camera and get everything back to its original state that we typically use for our indoor events. All right. Okay, status check. This is a series of 7 different screens that show the status of the camera. So you navigate between these with the up and down arrow. You can see how the camera is configured. So this screen showing, for example, is showing you what the different 6 assignable buttons are set to do. Notice here that I have assign button 4 set to digital extender. So if we need to use that double magnification during the middle of a shot, we certainly can. However, you can't change that while the camera is recording, so you need to make that judgment call before we actually start the recording on something. Showing the other configuration options here. So set to indoor white balance. So anyway, that's kind of all of that. The other options on here we don't need to necessarily worry about. They're not relevant to the recording. Media format's the option to format a memory card, so that deletes every file on a card. We may do that before the start of an event. If we need to do that, I will let you know. Otherwise, we don't need to worry about it. So that's essentially that for the menus on the camera. Now, the other thing I wanted to cover, and this is probably more relevant for running the camera, is how to actually use a lot of the different settings on the camera. So I can go over some of these buttons down here and what they do. Zoom in a bit. Whoops. So across the bottom of the camera here, the first thing we have right there, that's an up-down switch. So that's used to change the value for one of these particular settings. So on these cameras, in order to change a setting on the camera, what we have to do is we first press the button for that we want to change, and then we can use the up-down lever to make a change on that. However, that said, hopefully I can actually show this. Alright, so if we look at the display on the camera, and again, this is not actually shown on the camera output, but we have, let me drop the exposure down a little bit so you can read this. Okay, alright, so across the bottom here, the first number here is the F number. That's basically the iris of the lens. So the larger the number, the less light comes in through the camera. It's a little bit, it doesn't necessarily make sense until you understand more about what's going on there. But suffice it to say, when I make it a smaller number, you can see the image gets brighter. When I make it a larger number, the image gets darker. And the way that I'm actually doing that Switch to this camera. So there is a ring here, right here, that it's very narrow, and that ring is just there to adjust the iris. So if you need to adjust the iris, you grab that ring. It's the one that's farthest back on the camera. It's also the narrowest. You grab that one and rotate it. So you can see as I'm rotating that, the brightness of the image is changing. The other thing that changes is what we call the depth of field on the camera. So the larger the number, the more will actually be in focus in the image. So if you have two subjects, one's farther away than the other, you may need to increase the f-stop on the iris in order to have both of them in focus. Now doing that obviously darkens the image, so what we have to do is we have to compensate for that in another way. And that actually leads us to the second setting, which is the one that's currently highlighted, and that's the gain. So as it's going to be difficult to do here. So let me, I'm actually gaining up on the camera there, the camera that we're shooting on. So as you notice, the first button on here is actually gain. So if gain is highlighted, pressing the button again turns on automatic gain. So we don't necessarily want to do that. So with the gain number on the display highlighted, at that point we can actually move up and down on the lever. So as I'm doing that, you can see the brightness of the image changing. And so we can move up and down on that to increase the brightness on the video. All right. Okay. The next button here is white balance. So I'm going to press that to select it, and then pan back up, show the monitor. So you'll see now that in this case, the little light bulb is highlighted. This is the white balance setting. The light bulb is for indoor, and then we also have two other custom presets. Typically, I will do white balancing for you before we start an event, but if I tell you we need to do a white balance, this is where we go. We'll select one of the A or B presets, and then on the side of the camera there is a white balance set. So what we'll do is we'll aim the camera at something that's white or very neutral gray, and then press that button, and then the camera will adjust its video so that that actually does appear white and the other colors in the image are correct. All right. The next button is the shutter button. So I'm going to press that to select it. And this allows us to control the shutter speed of the camera. Again, pan back up. So now we can see that the shutter speed is the selected option on there. In this case, it's showing a 30. And what that means is that we're shooting with a shutter that refreshes the image. It leaves the shutter open for each frame of the image for 1/30th of a second. That will be typically what we use for indoor. When we go to outdoor events, that's going to change. So we may go something like 60 or even 100, 125. Typically, especially if we're shooting something that has a lot of action in it. The higher the number, the shorter the exposure, which means less blurring due to motion. When we're shooting indoor, though, where there's not a lot of light, we want to use something like 30 to allow the most light to be captured by the camera. So, all right, and the last button down there is full auto, and all I can tell you about that is never press that button. That puts the camera into fully automatic mode, where it determines the exposure. And well, I'll just leave it at this and say that while sometimes it does okay, it typically will screw up at the most inconvenient time for it to screw up if you leave it set on auto. So I recommend staying away from that. If it does happen to get pressed, the button turns green. So if you see that happen, press the button again, and we'll go back to a manual exposure. Alright, so let's go over a couple additional buttons on here. Alright, so the first one we'll talk about here is the iris button right here. So this button is what actually turns on the iris ring, so to allow you to change the iris. So pressing that button toggles between automatic iris and manually set iris. So if you want to adjust the iris, you make sure that iris control is on, and then turn the ring. If you turn the ring and you find nothing is happening, you reach down and press the iris button. Just below that we have the auto manual focus button. So if we need to do manual focusing for an event, press that button and that will turn it to manual focus. And then from there you can use the focus ring, which is the largest of the 3 rings on the camera. The center ring is your zoom. You can use that if you'd like, or you can use the zoom controller that is on the tripods. Alright, so the one last thing, I showed you guys a moment ago the status screens that are on the camera. Those can also be accessed by pressing the status button on the side of the camera. So as I press that, you can see that these status screens actually come up, and then you can use the up and down arrows to cycle between those. Or press the status button again to remove it. These other ones we won't use. Slow and S and Q, that's slow and quick. That's for high-speed motion. Slow motion, basically. We won't use that for when we're shooting live productions, and then display turns different elements of the arrow up here and show you what happens when we press that button. So that turns these helpful guides on and off. So if you want to shoot with a clean monitor with none of the helpful information, you can press the display button to turn that off, and just keep pressing the display button to cycle between the different options. So the slot select button, it's right here. That's for selecting which of the 2 memory card slots in the back are going to be recorded on. So right now we've only got one card in there in the top slot. There's nothing in the bottom slot, so pressing that button would actually do nothing. Alright. Okay. Alright, with that said, that covers basic control of the camera. Typically the only control you'll need to use during an event will be the gain. So it's helpful to know about the gain, but we also may get into situations where we need to do manual focus, or if we need to change the white balance because the color of the lighting has changed. So say for example we're shooting outdoors and it's getting late and the sun's going down, we may need to shift white balance, but for the most part the gain will be about the only option you'll need to touch during a production itself. So with that, should be the basics of what you need to know in order to run the camera. So we'll move on to other things. Okay, thanks for watching.